Today we have with us in the studio Professor Stuart Lang, who is a Pro-Vice Chancellor at the University of Brighton in the UK. Professor Lang completed his undergraduate studies at Cambridge University and has done his PhD from the University of Birmingham. After that, he taught at the University of Sussex, where he was the Dean of the School of Cultural and Community Studies, where I've also been a student during my PhD days. And now Professor Lang is at the University of Brighton. He is well known in the area of cultural studies, and he will talk to us about cultural criticism in Britain. Professor Lang has several publications, and I'll request Stuart to tell you a little bit about them. Some key publications that you might also want to look at yourself.
Probably a book that I wrote some years ago called Representations of Working Class Life, 1957 to 64, published by Macmillan in 1986, may be useful because it will give a bit of background to some of the key moment in development of cultural studies in Britain. More recently, perhaps also of interest, a paper I had in the journal Media, Culture and Society on Raymond Williams's work on television, and perhaps if people are interested in something a bit more up to the minute, an essay I had in a book called Writing in Cinema, edited by Jonathan Bignell, published by Longmans last year, I think, which was actually looking at 3 recent novels and films, including The English Patient and a very controversial novel and film called Crash. So those, I think, might be of interest to people who are following up both perhaps theories of cultural criticism, and in the last case perhaps an example of what I would call cultural criticism. Whether it's any good or not, obviously the readers will be able to judge for themselves.
Well, they can. Thank you, Stuart. I mean, after they read, they can decide what they want to get out of that, how advanced they want to go into this area. But before that, I would like to ask you a little bit about how cultural studies started in Britain, because there's always been some discussion on culture in Britain. And for people who are familiar with that here, we can just go back as far as Matthew Arnold, his Culture and Anarchy, and then Eliot's Notes towards the Definition of Culture, and F.R. Lewis's Mass Civilization and Minority Culture. And then in that tradition and in that continuum, you suddenly have a break in the 50s with Richard Hogarth's book, The Uses of Literacy, and Raymond Williams's Culture and Society, and also E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class.
Yes, yes.
What is it that was the change then, and how did cultural studies emerge?
Well, I think 3 things happened in the period, say 1945 to 1955, 56, that led to Thompson, Hogarth and Williams writing and developing certain kinds of work. The first thing was that if you go back to F.R. Lewis, Mass Civilization and Minority Culture, and other work of that kind, which posited, as it were, a rather negative and pessimistic view of what mass cultural change had done to cultural values. There was, within some of Lewis's pupils went out to teach in schools, from the 30s on, certainly into the 40s and 50s. I was taught by a pupil Lewis myself at school, in fact in the 1960s, a bit later. There was, among some of them, an attempt to say, well, if what Lewis had said is that mass civilization must always be a problem and must always have a lack of cultural values as opposed to minority culture, new mass forms, film, radio and so forth. What some of Lewis's pupils said, well, the issue of discrimination, the issue of qualitative analysis is very important, but let's not necessarily write off all mass culture to begin with. Perhaps the issue is not so much discriminating against mass culture, but discriminating within mass culture. And somebody, I just mentioned a name that people can follow if they want, Dennis Thompson, who published a book, edited a book called Discrimination in Popular Culture in 1964, but also published work in the 30s. What Dennis Thompson and people like him did was begin to open up the notion that there might be some positive elements in the new mass culture, as well as a lot of negative elements, and the approach of it by Lewis could help us identify it. So there was a sort of strand of English teaching in schools. But there were 2 other things. One common denominator that Williams, Hogarth and Thompson had is that they all taught in adult education initially, after they, in different ways, left the army at the end of the Second World War in Europe. And they brought out of the army some traditions that had developed in the face of a strong democratising principle during the Second World War in Britain. They brought out of the army experience of working in workers' adult education in what was called the Army Bureau of Current Affairs, that had a mass education programme for the army. And they brought out of that a wish to take general ideas about society, culture, to the general population. So Hoggart and Thompson worked in the area of Yorkshire in the north of England, and Rain Williams actually at that time was working in the county of Sussex. And what their adult education did was to take, could be literature, it might be architecture, it might be painting or philosophy, but the kind of students they working with, students in their 30s, 40s, whatever, were students who wanted very consciously to relate the meaning and value of this work to their own experience. So there was a real pressure from that educational context, those students, to say, how is this relevant to my experience? How can I make it relate to my general social life? So that was the second thing, and I think the notion of culture that Williams developed in Culture and Society, and the kind of idea of relating mass publications to ordinary life that Hoggart developed in literature came from that. But there was finally one third thing. And the third thing was a bit surprising to Hoggart and Williams. When they wrote the kind of books they wrote in the 50s that were published towards the end of the 50s, those books do not talk about television at all, by and large, because television at the time they were writing the books in the early 50s was still emerging. However, by the time the books actually got published and began to have an effect, was exactly the period when there was an extraordinarily fast development of television in Britain, such that in a period of 10 years through the 1950s, television moved from there being 350,000 sets in the country to about 10 or 12 million. Phenomenally fast increase in a society with a population of about 50 million. And when the books came out, they provided a kind of model, a way of thinking about this new phenomenon of television, which actually Hoggart and Williams hadn't themselves looked at directly, but the ideas and the concepts seemed the ones that were most suited to try and understand this new major cultural phenomenon that was developing very quickly, and very few people could understand its effect. And I think it was a mix of those three things that produced the sense that there needed to be a field of cultural studies, which was linked to English studies and indeed sociology, but was different from it. And I think that historical moment, as always, it's often two or three different things that come together in a historical moment that produce a shift of that kind.
And this was institutionalized then in the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in 1964 in Birmingham, where a whole lot of exciting work was initiated by people like Stuart Hall, Hoggart and others. What was it special in that work which we can relate to literary studies?
Well, the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at Birmingham, as you say, started in 1964, and I was a student there a bit later in the early 70s. And it was started by Richard Hoggart. And its start, I think, is quite interesting, and I hope a little anecdote, a little detail may be helpful. Stop me if I go on too long, I'm sure you will. In 1960 in Britain, there was a very famous cultural event, which is popularly known as the Trial of Lady Chatterley. It was actually, ever since the death of D.H. Lawrence in 1930, publication of his book Lady Chatterley's Lover had not been allowed in Britain, or publishers were afraid to publish it because they thought they would be charged under the Obscene Publications Act. During the late 1950s, for various reasons which would be the subject of a separate programme, a revised version of the Obscene Publications Act came out, and Penguin Books, which was a very prestigious publisher, very prestigious popular publisher at that time, probably more prestigious than it is now actually in many ways, decided for its 30th anniversary in 1960, because the firm had been founded in 1930, to test the new law by publishing an edition of Lady Chatterley's Lover. And they published it, and the Crown prosecution decided they would test the law by prosecuting. Of course, what they actually prosecuted was not Lady Chatterley, nor even the book. They prosecuted the publisher, Penguin Books. And the trial that went on for 3 or 4 days involved a whole set of people being called on, from E.M. Forster, who was called out of King's College, Cambridge, where he was in his dotage almost at that time, to come and testify to the value of the book, and Richard Hoggart, and many others. But the star,
including Leavis, I think.
Leavis didn't actually appear on the stand, but he was quoted a lot.
Okay.
He was quoted a lot. He was a kind of background to it. I think Leavis was a bit, I suspect he was asked, but I think he was probably a little grouchy about it. But, that may be a matter of historical debate, needs to be looked into. But he was certainly a significant context for it. You're absolutely right. And but Richard Hoggart was the star witness, because he particularly emphasised that, in his view, what Lawrence's book at the end of the day was, despite all the use of apparent obscene language, was a profoundly moral book, because it attempted to look very hard at the nature of human relationships, not to shy away from difficult problems there, and to develop a profounder understanding of the very, very difficult question between sexual desire and human relationships. Very difficult question. Much literature deals with it, from Madame Bovary, Shakespeare. Literature deals with it because it's a profound and difficult human question. But as a result of that trial, Penguin Books was acquitted, and a relationship grew up between the owner of Penguin Books, Alan Lane, and Richard Hoggart. And it was Alan Lane. It was partly the sponsorship of Penguin Books for the original Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies that allowed Hoggart to start it. And the point of this anecdote really is that at the start, the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies was very much concerned with the question of taking a certain approach to literature, an approach which in a way was founded in Leavis, an approach of looking at the values, the structures, the symbols in literature, but applying that not only to literature, but to popular literature, to mass media, maybe to other areas of social life too, a kind of reading of social life, if you like, according to the values that were contained in them. So initially, it was very much an attempt to extend the position of literary criticism as something which could provide an evaluation of the quality of contemporary life from literature into other areas, still including literature as well, but extending it to other areas as well. Now that was the initial project, but it changed over time.
But you said that they looked at Leavisite readings of literature and other cultural forms.
Yes.
But what else was it? I mean, wasn't there a kind of certain link between the formation of this centre and the failure of left activism in Britain?
Well, yes. I mean, I think, and obviously, one doesn't want to go into too much detail, but there's. I think people who started were there at the beginning of the centre in 1964 wouldn't necessarily have predicted the way it went or the way its ideas were developed, because on the whole, initially, it was not a way of analysis that was very heavily theoretical. It was very much empirical. One would attend with one's sensitivities and one's skills as literary critic to cultural objects and kind of read them in a practical criticism poetry kind of way. However, the 1960s was an extraordinarily fast developing moment of cultural change for Britain. And as the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies got going, whole waves of other ideas and theories came in to it. Initially, particularly from Europe, where new forms of Marxism, Jean-Paul Sartre's linking of existentialist Marxism in France, the rereading of the Frankfurt School from Germany, whole kinds of new kinds of Marxism which paid much more attention to what's called the superstructure, the consciousness, or the ideology rather than economic base, came to be re-experienced in Britain. At the same time, a particularly formalistic analysis of language, but one nevertheless that seemed to have a lot of power for analysis, called structuralism or semiotics, developed or was imported from France with the work initially of Saussure and then more latterly Roland Barthes. And I think what that produced was a real shift in the way the centre worked, in saying we actually have to become much more theoretical. We have to certainly out-argue our opponents by showing that our positions are much more rigorous, much more theorised, much more philosophically sound than some people have said. And this, I think, produced a development, not so much led by Stuart Hall, but Stuart Hall, I think, was much more temperamentally inclined to that than Richard Hoggart, who, towards the end of the decade, went to Paris to work for UNESCO. and the centre started moving in some different directions and opening up much more consciously questions of cultural theory, which of course included profound questions of literary theory.
So up to this point, what we can say about cultural studies is that it sort of took on board a lot of concepts and ideas from literature, from sociology, from history.
Yes.
It took on close textual reading, much in the Lewisite manner, and it also took a lot of theoretical rigor from European developments in critical theory.
Yes.
And also, of course, it was political.
It was political in the sense in which people involved in it on the whole wanted to, political in two senses, I think. Firstly, it's political in a intellectual sense, in that the nature of the work was often profoundly interdisciplinary, and therefore it didn't dismiss traditional disciplines like English literature or sociology or history as separate, but it said the kind of work that needs to be done on this area is one that needs to draw from all these areas and in some sense go beyond them. And I think, and this has been a continuing debate since then between English literature and cultural studies, it's like a certain kind of marriage, perhaps. So there are tensions and there are coming togethers and there are falling apart because they do tread over the same territory, rightly so, and they borrow things from each other, but there are some differences in their areas of attention.
Because in 1985 there was a book by Jonathan Dollimore and Alan Sinfield who became spokespersons for, cultural materialism, and the book was called Political Shakespeare.
Yes.
And they in a way defined what the agenda for cultural materialism was, a term which they were borrowing from Raymond Williams. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I mean, the background to that really is that tracking through the 1970s, a number of new waves of thought started hitting cultural studies and indeed literary studies more generally in Britain, drawn partly from Europe, partly from America, and at a later stage partly from all around the world. Firstly, feminism was very strong. Feminism was a very strong proposition from the late 60s and began to become a powerful theoretical challenge to traditional Marxism. To put it rather bluntly, traditional Marxism would say, let's see what's going on in the novel in terms of the social structure, who's got the power, who hasn't, are the ideas in support of any particular social group, and so forth. What gender studies, feminist studies did, was to say, let's put that to one side for a minute, and let's actually look at how novels or poems set up, define, explore, elaborate on relationships between men and women, or stereotypes of men and women, and let's see that as important, maybe more important than issues of general class and power. That disturbed a lot of men and disturbed the theoretical model. But quickly behind that came other things as well. Firstly, an extension of the issue in feminism to other issues to do with different sorts of sexual orientations, gay studies, lesbian studies. Perhaps more important, or equally important anyway, slightly later, a significant attempt to develop and redevelop ideas coming from the field of what had previously been called post-colonial literature, maybe still was, literary studies, but ones that actually didn't simply reverse the model, as it were, of saying, well, previously we valued British writers writing about colonial work, now we'll value writers from the colonies or the empire writing. It actually took a more rigorous theoretical approach and tried to talk about notions of hybridization, changing identity, and so forth. Now, all that created a space of, one might say confusion, but at least a seething ferment of ideas. And one way through all this that tempted to sustain a sort of Marxist position, or position one could learn from Marxism, was to say, well, we can actually think about what's going on in terms of cultural materialism. Now, the point about the notion of cultural materialism was this. In the past, people who'd been put forward a traditional Marxist view of literature were often criticised because they apparently were too materialist. They placed too much emphasis on literature not being about ideas and consciousness, but being only a reflection of the economic or social base. And the point about that was that it appeared to write out all the creativity of the writer. What cultural materialism says, actually that's wrong, because in fact we should say that study of literature has not been materialist enough, in the sense in which we must now regard literary creation itself as a material act, in two senses. Firstly, that any literary creation, literary production has to occur through a particular institution, publishing, theatre, forms of distribution, whatever. And that's a profound and important understanding, because unless you understand that, you won't actually understand the constraints and opportunities that writers have. The second point was perhaps even more radical. It said we should actually understand language itself as material. Language, it's a particular notes on a bit of paper, has a material reality. Even the words we're now speaking have a materiality, because they only work because they vibrate sound through the air, and you can understand that as a physical property. So that notion of cultural materialism emphasised, did not dispense at all with creativity, but saw that creativity as a form of creative literary production, working on pre-given materials, taking it forward. Now, the work that Alan and Jonathan did in particular called Shakespeare took that idea, and really I think there are three related things they were saying about Shakespeare in that book, and their contributors. They overlap, but they are slightly different, and they can take one in different directions. Firstly, they said, and this perhaps was not all that new, but it included this. They said, well, it is always the case in any form of history that however much we try, we cannot avoid as historians, in this case literary historians, reading the past in part in our own image. And some of the issues we're most concerned about today, let's say, are gender, and therefore there was a lot of concern to have a look again at issues in particularly Shakespeare's comedies of gender identity, cross-dressing and so forth, and try and understand the significance of that, both in terms of a Renaissance view of the world that was coming under challenge, and relating a lot of that to notions of carnivore from Bakhtin and others. Secondly, they said, well, there was a more conscious attempt to say, well, there is also legitimacy in consciously reading Shakespeare in terms of our ideas now. And this again was not entirely new, because it's always been the case that criticism has said, if a writer is a value, even of universal value, like Shakespeare, it means they will be able to give different meanings to different ages. Different ages will interpret them in different ways. And in a way, the cultural materialism bit of that, or at least the way it was figured in that book, was to say, okay, fine, let's celebrate that, let's enjoy that, let's work with that, let's see what Shakespeare can say to us. The third thing was probably newer, I think, although in a way some Shakespeare scholars have all been interested in it. Let me give you an example of the third one, very briefly. There's an essay, I think, in that book, or certainly one of the others, books around Shakespeare at that time, by a man called Graham Holderness, who's now works at the University of Hertfordshire. And he looked at the film of Henry V, beg your pardon, which has a famous film which has Laurence Olivier in it as Henry V, and has some excellent filmically. And he looked at the production of that film, which occurred during the period of the Second World War in Britain. The film came out in 1944, and showed that the way in which that film was put together, the aims of the people writing it, the way in which writing it, editing it, putting it together from the script, Shakespeare's script, if you like, that and the way it was received, very much related to a particular context of the need to develop and create a state of consciousness for British war effort. I.e., and that kind of cultural materialism then has analysed how the actual specific ways, historical ways in which Shakespeare gets reproduced in our age. And of course Shakespeare is a very good example of that, because Shakespeare is reproduced all around the globe in education syllabuses, in drama productions, in festivals, in all sorts of things. And as another way of understanding how literature works, what it is, what meanings we can take from it, it was another dimension. all of that, when you put all that together, it's a pretty rich and heady mixture, especially when it has some theoretical elements in it too. And certainly some Shakespeare scholars were quite upset about the approaches in that book.
Well, now let's come to Raymond Williams's concept of structure of feeling,
Right.
Which Williams defined as meanings and values as they are lived and felt.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
this sort of in a way connects with what you were saying about the recovery of history
Yes.
in Shakespeare, for instance.
Yes.
I mean, how would this actually help a literary critic?
Well, it is a difficult concept, and I think one shouldn't criticise Williams for not necessarily using it in a stable way in his career at different times. I mean, he would have said, and did say, that it was a suggestive idea that people should use analytically, not attempt to...
Mechanically or anything
Absolutely, absolutely, no, that's right, thank you. The origins of it actually go back to work he did on drama in the early 50s, or late 40s, early 50s, on Ibsen. But perhaps the most famous example of it is in the Long Evolution, a chapter on the 1840s, when he talks about structure of feeling being a way of understanding the Victorian novel, and particularly being a way of understanding the repetition or common patterns of symbols, of metaphors, of tone and atmosphere, to use a rather general phrase, that appear in those novels. Something which is not consciously put there, something which can't be reduced to an ideology, a set of rational statements, but is a kind of distilled social experience. I think in one place he talks about it, structure of feeling, as a kind of colour through which everything is passed in a particular period. And what the notion of structure of feeling is trying to get at is to try and hold together, on the one hand, the Leavisite tradition of wanting to look at literature as a kind of distilled or concentrated experience that one can relate to and engage with and recognise and get value from, in some sense, with the notion that this is not something that will occur purely as a result of a writer's individual vision. Not that necessarily that was Leavis's view, because Leavis had a keen historical sense, but it was something that came out of or referred to actual historical conditions in the society. Now, on the whole, that notion of structure of feeling is not something that people in the period would recognise for themselves. Well, this is one of the debating points in his work. So the fact that...
that would be something emergent or something which is not quite settled.
That's right, because it's precisely because it's emergent or not settled or in process that you can't articulate it explicitly at the time, although you may begin to reflect on it as you see it emerging. So it's an attempt to say it's possible to see historical patterns in literature, patterns that refer to the way a historical period has shaped literature. But that should be done in a way that's attentive to the fact that literature is not philosophy. It's not a set of rational propositions, it's a set of symbols, it's a dramatisation, it's something that is perhaps less tangible or less easily summarised. And in that sense, I think can tell us how literature relates to history. It is a difficult concept, but I think the intention behind it is important, even if always the way it was realised isn't, let's say, perfect, isn't concluded, isn't finished. I think one final point. I think Williams never quite resolved a question about it, which is to what extent there was a single structure of feeling in a period to which writers from different positions might relate differentially, or whether there might be a number of structures of feeling occurring with different classes and cultures. I think we would tend to go for the second one now, because I think, looking back, one of the criticisms one would make of that early phase of British cultural studies is that it tended to have too unitary a sense of a particular society, a particular culture. While that might have been true of British society, or at least the way British society likes to think of itself, I think anybody living in any modern society, whether it's India or Britain, I think, will recognise that we live in a plurality of cultures, which overlap, And of course, globalisation pushes other things onto us, but which overlap, but are different, and we need to recognise that.
But would you agree that now that cultural studies has moved elsewhere, to Australia, to the United States, this plurality of cultures, isn't that what is sort of central to cultural studies in the United States, as opposed to this kind of, class conflicts in British society?
Yes, I think so. I would register a disappointment about American cultural studies, but any American colleagues watching this, please forgive me, because I wouldn't pretend to be as expert as some in this. But if I compare the work I've seen from American colleagues and, let's say, Australian colleagues, the thing that strikes me is they're rather less interested in relating particular cultural phenomena, be it literature or media or whatever. It seems to me they are rather less interested in relating that to the actual life experience, the actual social structures and social organisation in America, than certainly some of the work I've seen from Australian colleagues, who have found the notion of cultural studies a very powerful way of trying to think about their own national identity and what it means and what it might mean. Now, it is true that the notion of cultural studies one needs now, and to some extent the notion of literary studies, literature in English as an example, needs to often take an international perspective quite consciously, because culture flows around the world. Notions of postmodernism speak to us of an experience that many people have in their lives of living between cultures and across national cultures, even if only by virtue of what they see on television or get through the internet or whatever. So I think I could forgive some of that lack, but I think there is a slight danger of simply taking a method of analysis or an approach and just applying it to the surface phenomena of culture. That's not quite the right word, the phenomena of culture, without making that critical connection that Hoggart and Williams wanted to make between the literary work or the media work or whatever, and both the society from which it came and the society which it's going into at the moment, at any given moment. That's a difficult analytical task, but often it's more a frame of mind one can have about the work, a way of thinking about literary study that can help, even if you don't have the time or the inclination to pursue that into the sociological or historical study itself.
I think that's been a very interesting discussion, and I hope our students have benefited from this very clear notion of what cultural materialism is, what cultural studies, how it has evolved in Britain over the last 30 years. And I hope they will have some understanding and ability to understand literary texts. Thank you very much, Stuart.
Thank you.